I'm Maggie McDaniel, the head of intelligence at Recorded Future, and today we'll be discussing the threats to this year's Olympic Games that are being held in Paris. If you've not grabbed it yet, you can find our report on the Recorded Future website. It was probably posted about 2 hours ago, so do go download that and take a look. A few administrative items before we get started. There will be a recording of this available to you after the webinar, and you may post questions in the Q&A, and I will weave those in as we can, or one of the participants on our panel may respond to you or the group directly today. Today we are talking about the Olympic Games as they face numerous threats due to the high-profile nature and global significance. The profile and international nature of the event makes it prime target for those seeking to cause ideological motivated harm, engage in criminal activities, or embarrass the host nation on the world stage. Our group today is here to specifically discuss state-sponsored cyber threats, cybercriminal and hacktivist threat activity, malign influence, and threats to physical security. Before we get started with our presentation, I would appreciate each of the team members introducing themselves to you, as some of them may be new to you. So, team, as you are compelled to present.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Kelly. I'm a principal analyst within Insikt Group. Specifically, I work within our strategic and persistent threats team. And essentially, our team is tasked with the technical tracking of state-sponsored cyber operations. So going to talk a little bit about that today in relation to the Olympics. Thank you.
Fantastic. Matt?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Mooney. I'm a senior manager on the global issues team within Recorded Future's Insikt Group. Our team focuses on strategic geopolitics, influence operations, and threats to physical security. And I'll be speaking today about the disruptive protests and threats posed by terrorist groups to the Paris Olympics.
Alex?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alexander Leslie. I'm a threat intelligence analyst with our advanced cybercrime and engagements team, and my research is primarily focused on the Russian and Russian-speaking cybercriminal underground. That's what we're going to be talking about today.
And Brian?
Morning, everybody. My name is Brian Liston. I am a senior intelligence analyst with Insikt Group's global issues team, focusing primarily on Russian influence operations and propaganda, which influence operations targeting Olympics will be the main focus of my talk today. Thank you.
Great. All right, Mark, I think you're kicking us off with state-sponsored cyber threats.
Excellent. Yes. Okay, so hello, everyone. So within this first section, I will be talking through some of the key takeaways from our analysis, specifically in relation to state-sponsored cyber threats facing the Olympics. So just to preface, in terms of state-sponsored threats, we focused primarily on what we would call the big four, so China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, as we assess they are the most likely countries to engage in targeting of the games. So starting off a little bit around kind of intelligence gathering and cyber espionage activity, we do assess that state-sponsored threat actors will likely conduct cyber espionage campaigns opportunistically using the Olympics. So, for example, this may be a lure within a phishing campaign, email, a malicious document kind of pertaining to relate to the games, or potentially malicious infrastructure that's spoofing specific Olympics related entities. And really, the opportunistic use of major events in this kind of way is very common, given that these kind of topical and high-profile events are more likely to engage a target effectively and cause them to click on a link, enter their credentials, or download some sort of malicious attachment to an email, for example. Regarding more subversive activity, so talking about disruptive or destructive cyber attacks, here we assess that Russia is most likely to attempt to carry out such activity and possesses the capability and the intent to do so. However, it's worth kind of caveating that with the fact that we believe this is likely to be somewhat restrained given France's NATO membership and other factors. So as such, we don't expect to see, for example, the kind of overt attacks on critical infrastructure that we may see within Ukraine's telecommunication or power infrastructure over the last few years, for example, which involve the use of destructive capabilities such as industrial control system specific malware. So we don't expect to see kind of that level of overt attack on critical infrastructure. However, this does not discount attempted disruptive or destructive attacks from Russian state-sponsored actors. And in fact, many options remain available beyond those particular kind of types of operations. So instead, such disruptive attacks are likely to be deniable, first and foremost, however thin the veneer of deniability may be. And this may be achievable through states using or creating proxy groups, using kind of hacktivist personas or hacktivist fronts, or even through co-opting cybercriminal actors to conduct this activity on their behalf. These efforts may also employ influence operations in tandem, such as hack and leak tactics, as we've seen in the past from Russian state-sponsored actors. And we'll touch on various elements of this as we move through the presentation. So for now, we'll explore some of the threat vectors for Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea in some more detail. Starting with Russia. So I've kind of mentioned so far, but we assess that there's a high likelihood of state-sponsored cyber espionage activity and or disruptive operations from Russian state actors. So there's ample motivation here, both against the International Olympics Committee, given actions taken against Russian athletes in recent years, and indeed against France and NATO more widely in the backdrop of the Ukraine war. There's also kind of significant historical precedent for Russian actors targeting Olympic Games. So back in 2020, there was alleged reconnaissance activity attempting to disrupt the event, attributed to Russia's military intelligence directorate, the GRU. In 2018, another GRU-linked group called Sandworm conducted a kind of overt destructive attack using the Olympic destroyer malware, and in this case attempted to do so in a false flag kind of manner, so emulating a known North Korean state-sponsored actor in order to try and kind of hinder attribution efforts and muddy the waters there a little bit. Moving back further, there was also kind of hack and leak campaigns involving the World Athletics Doping Association attributed to another GRU-affiliated actor, Blue Delta, otherwise known as APT28, and additional activity around targeting of doping officials within hotels, such as Wi-Fi networks, and kind of compromising actual routers within these facilities to target these entities. So clearly kind of a strong precedent here that shows that even though the kind of overt physical impact causing attacks on critical infrastructure are less likely, there's still plenty of options available for deniable subversive operations. Moving on to talk about China, and really here we've seen pretty limited historical precedent for targeting international sporting events. Generally, China is a lot more restrained in conducting these types of destructive attacks compared to some of the other countries on screen, and they do have a relatively stable diplomatic and economic relationship with France, and indeed are obviously kind of significant proponents and participants within the Olympic Games and have an interest in an uninterrupted games. However, there are some potential kind of opportunistic cyber espionage activity, be it against select attendees or Olympics affiliated organizations, as well as the use of Olympics-themed phishing campaigns, as I mentioned, in a more opportunistic manner. Moving on to Iran, and here again, similar to China, we do kind of assess that it's unlikely to conduct destructive or destructive attacks against the Olympics, primarily due to the risk of escalation with NATO and further economic sanctions, despite tensions that do exist between the two countries. And really, we have seen some historical targeting of major events from Iranian state-sponsored actors in the past, including the Munich Security Summit and the Think 20 Summit in Saudi Arabia a couple of years ago. So as such, I think Olympics-related cyber operations are most likely to target high-profile foreign attendees, particularly dissidents and critics of the Iranian regime in more of a kind of counterintelligence type viewpoint. So finally, moving on to talk about North Korea. Similar to Iran and China, we haven't really seen much historical activity targeting international sporting events from North Korean actors. Actually, this is the first games the DPRK will participate in since 2018, as they withdrew from the 2020 Tokyo Olympics and were subsequently banned from the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. And they do have a kind of relatively small contingent of competitors, but there is a lot of kind of national pride and pro-regime propaganda linked to the game from a DPRK perspective. So again, there is a government interest here in a kind of uninterrupted games to bolster the national image. So yeah, as we kind of go through this, we'll see that not just in the cyber realm, but across other vectors, that Russia is kind of one of the primary threats here, as we see it from a straight perspective. So with that, we will be moving on to cover some of the cyber criminal threats facing the games, and I'll hand you over to Alex.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. So the bottom line really here is that cybercriminals and hacktivists are inherently opportunistic and they are inherently reactionary. We assess that they will likely capitalize on international attention regarding the Paris Olympic Games for both financial and political gain. Ransomware groups, being the primary threat that organizations are going to face, will primarily target suppliers, sponsors, and other third-party organizations instead of targeting primary Olympics infrastructure. Ransomware operators work very closely with initial access brokers who will likely see an increased market demand for credentials and accesses affecting those suppliers, those sponsors, and those third-party organizations. Thus, we will see likely an increase in credentials and accesses affecting the Olympics on the dark web over the next few weeks. And then finally, the Olympics presents an ideal opportunity for hacktivists to capitalize on those geopolitical undertones and garner widespread attention, as attention is their primary motivator. So let's dive into each of those threat vectors with more detail. So first, we're going to talk about ransomware. Now, while a coordinated ransomware attack on Olympics infrastructure is highly unlikely, we assess that third-party organizations are likely at a heightened risk of a ransomware attack due to the significant pressure these organizations face in order to maintain operational continuity. If some of these sponsors, suppliers, vendors, and third-party organizations, as to include delegate countries, are attacked by a ransomware attack, whether that be disruptive or destructive, the downtime with that ransomware attack will inherently affect the operations of the Olympics. The underlying goal of a ransomware attack is to elicit a ransom payment, and you generally do that through a sense of urgency. That sense of urgency is going to have really heightened expectations and international attention with regards to the Olympics. Now, there is precedent for ransomware attacks on primary Olympics infrastructure. This happened in April 2020 with a ransomware attack on the Japanese Olympic Committee, but we don't think that this is as likely in 2024 as an attack on a third-party organization that supplies or contributes to the operations of the Olympics itself. Now, ransomware attacks targeting France have been steadily increasing over the last year. According to the Recorded Future Ransomware Dashboard, we're looking at approximately 150 unique victims within France in the last year that have been targeted by ransomware and have appeared on dark web ransomware extortion blogs. Many of these organizations sit within critical infrastructure sectors, those being government, healthcare, education, financial services, and others. These organizations, if impacted, will likely have an indirect effect on the Paris Olympics. A lot of other organizations in France and outside of France have also been targeted by ransomware over the last year that include sporting organizations, sporting goods manufacturers, sporting teams, and even independent organizations, delegations to the Olympics. So this is something to keep in mind. Given the sense of urgency and the tight time frame to elicit a ransom payment, we'd likely see additional extortion techniques going along with a ransomware campaign, those being distributed denial of service attacks, website defacement, doxing, targeted harassment, dark web name and shame, and hack and leak operations, all in order to give that sense of urgency to a potential victim. But we must still stress that we don't assess a coordinated ransomware campaign against the Olympics itself as likely. Rather, we think organizations, potentially low-hanging fruit, is what ransomware actors are going to go after. Now, ransomware actors gain access to an organization often through an initial access broker. An initial access broker, our secondary vector, is going to be one of those threat actors that are specialized in selling compromised credentials or accesses on dark web forums to ransomware affiliates. Over the last 3 months, Insikt Group has identified approximately 17 new and noteworthy postings related to initial access targeting entities in France on the dark web. We've identified an additional 14 accesses for sale targeting organizations that could be potentially related to the Olympics. Again, these include sporting organizations, athletic goods manufacturers, and sporting teams within countries that are, of course, participating in the Olympics. So over 30 new and noteworthy posts. Now, what does new and noteworthy mean? That means within that dark web post, we see some kind of identifiers that signal if this was to be sold to a ransomware actor, this would have severe operational disruption, not only for that entity, but potentially for the Olympics. Now, we note that most conversations about initial access are taking place off of the forums in private channels, so this is not the full scope, but this is a significant increase from not only Q4 of 2023, but the previous year. So this increase in initial access sales is really something to keep an eye on over the next few weeks. Now, initial access sales are often selling compromised credentials, usually compromised through database breaches, combo lists, or information stealer logs. With regards to the Olympics, these compromised credentials can target employees, they can target participants, they can even target spectators, people that are trying to just buy tickets for the Olympics. Over the last 3 months, we've identified over 620 references to compromised credentials registered for domains related to the Olympics. Now, whether or not these are employees, participants, or observers, we are not entirely clear on, but this is a marked increase from last year and a significant increase in only the last month. Even a good case study that we have in the report that you can read on the Recorded Future website is of a potential International Olympic Committee employee who has a compromised info stealer log available for sale on a dark web shop. You know, these compromised credentials enable a range of attacks, whether they be social engineering, ransomware, data extortion, business email compromise, and they're largely harvested through either information stealer logs or phishing campaigns. In the last 3 months, we've identified over 1,400 references to phishing domains targeting the Olympics, both within France and around the world. Phishing is going to be the primary vector for effectively the way that you're going to harvest credentials, sell them to initial access brokers, and then those initial access brokers are going to sell them to ransomware operators. Now, our final threat vector that we need to talk about, which we believe will be not only the least significant operationally of the bunch, but the loudest of the bunch, will be hacktivist groups. The overwhelming majority of hacktivist claims are false. They're exaggerated in impact, or they are misleading, intended to sow chaos and inflate the reputation of hacktivist groups. The primary threat here is going to be distributed denial of service or website defacement attacks. And like Mark alluded to, there will be legitimate hacktivist groups that are often either co-opted by cybercriminal organizations or are fronts for nation-state activity. But the overwhelming majority of hacktivist activity is generally going to be of low credibility. With the primary threats to the Olympics, we separate these hacktivists out into 2 categories that are going to be of primary concern. The first being pro-Russian hacktivists. Everyone knows these groups well. They will largely target Olympics infrastructure and participating nations as a reactionary way to both the ongoing doping scandal and the effects of enforcement that has on the Russian delegation, as well as the enforcement in 2022 related to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. These groups are primarily looking for organizations that they claim to be Russophobic or anti-Russian, many of which are conveniently located in NATO or the EU, and many are in France. So we obviously see groups that you can reference in the report, like the very quiet Anonymous Sudan, the now defunct Killnet, No Name, the Cyber Army of Russia, groups that we think are likely going to capitalize on international attention and target the Olympics. And then the second group is going to be what we call Middle Eastern nexus threat activity, because of a lot of contradictory and opaque ideologies going on there, whether they're self-proclaimed Israeli hacktivist groups, self-proclaimed pro-Palestinian hacktivist groups, often targeting entities located in Europe for their support of either Israel or Palestine. So groups like this, Turk Hack Team, Mysterious Team Bangladesh, Rootkit, very common names within the cybercriminal underground, but they're going to cite the typical motivations either for France's support of either Israel or Palestine, other countries' support for one of these two parties, or a potential narrative that we're seeing in hacktivist circles, motivations related to the permission of Israeli athletes at this Olympics, claiming that there's a double standard about allowing Israeli athletes to compete. So that's primarily what we're going to deal with: ransomware, initial access brokers, credential harvesting, and then hacktivism, in the order of priority as to which are going to be of the most concern, not only to organizations, but to attendees.
Alex, thank you so much. Before we pivot into kind of the misinformation space, for you and Mark, we had a couple questions presented specifically around kind of targeted verticals, and those being specifically, have we seen anything around healthcare targeting or large cloud service providers? Is that anything you could speak to?
I think from a targeted perspective, haven't seen indicators against either healthcare or cloud service providers to date. But yeah, nothing to kind of preclude that taking place over the next few weeks as things continue to ramp up.
With regards to ransomware victimology in France, the primary organizations, the primary industries targeted are going to typically be manufacturing, construction, professional services, but we have seen creep into the top 5 over the last year: healthcare, education, and critical infrastructure, targeted by ransomware groups. So obviously, with that increase, we can't prove any correlation or causation to the Olympics itself, but it is something to be mindful of because that is a noteworthy trend over the past year.
All right, Brian.
Great. Thank you, Maggie. So as we know, the Olympic Games have often been a stage to display athleticism and sport, but also geopolitical tensions and conflicts. Historically, the Olympics have been a battleground for political rivalries, such as during the Cold War era boycotts. And now more recently, exclusion of Russian athletes due to state-sponsored doping schemes, and of course, the war in Ukraine. As we approach the 2024 Olympics, that situation is no different. We've highlighted in our report how state actors, Russia, China, Iran, and as well as an outlier with Azerbaijan, leveraging the Paris Olympics to amplify narratives that serve their geopolitical interests, often at the expense of the host nation France and its allies. These operations are not only targeting Olympics, but are also intertwined with broader geopolitical conflicts. I again mentioned the Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Hamas, and Nagorno-Karabakh, and more. Nation states will very likely continue to leverage that high visibility of the Olympics, looking here in 2024 and going forward, to advance their present longer-term geopolitical agendas and propagate that influence. These actions, especially when we talk about Paris 2024, are not only aimed at discrediting that host nation, but again, promoting those own narratives in their own ongoing global conflicts. So let's look at each of the threat vectors from malign influence further, starting with Russia. There is, as we've seen already, there is an established precedent in the sense of traditional state-sponsored cyber threats from the last 3 Olympics for Russian actors to undermine the Olympics when Russia is excluded or athletes are forced to participate as neutrals. And this applies to Russia conducted or directed influence operations as well. As we've stated, the Russian government holds many grievances against the International Olympic Committee for preventing Russia to participate formally, dating as far back as with the doping schemes or with some of the exclusionary measures that the IOC has taken for its continued support to Ukraine. Again, Russian athletes, they can participate, but they must do so as neutrals, which can be interpreted as a form by Russia of anti-Russia bias or discriminatory natures. We've seen this from Kremlin officials a lot. And there's also that sense of, I think, embarrassment associated with that when they're not able to kind of participate on that stage. As a result, Russia has and almost will certainly continue to attempt to undermine and discredit the Paris Olympics through multiple ongoing malign influence operations, including both in that overt state media or Kremlin official sphere, as well as in the covert influence operation space. And Russia will view this as a proportionate response to what Russia perceives as, again, that anti-Russia bias, those anti-Russian activities. Overall, across all four of the case studies that we have in our report, I would say that the activity out of Russia is very much the bulk majority of all influencer operations against the Olympics. Observed malign narratives emanating from Russia sources suggest that suggest that France is unprepared to host the Olympic Games, that the games pose a significant European safety and security risk. And going back to that theme of the IOC politicizing the games with that anti-Russia and unfair bias. It's very likely that we'll continue to see covert influence activity against the Olympics by Russian influence assets, including coordinated inauthentic behavior to promote Kremlin propaganda or inauthentic news coverage around the event, such as security around the event, attendance, sanitary conditions in places like hotels or public spaces, from operations that we track extensively, from the doppelganger operation to what is known as combat or the Matryoshka campaign. Much of that malign influence activity we see out of Russia right now aims to undermine France's preparations for the game security, as I mentioned. Recently, some evidence of fabricating physical security threats from extremist organizations or eroding public interest in the games, hoax phone calls against the IOC and fake documentaries about the undermined politicization of the games. And then outside of the Olympics, too, there's several physical influence activities in Paris tracked recently, linked back to Russian actors, including anti-Semitic graffiti, and, of course, most recently, the staging of coffins of the French soldiers of the Ukraine near the Eiffel Tower over the weekend. We've also seen online sources promote claims of diseases, rat infestations, Ukrainian military and refugees allegedly bringing tuberculosis to the country, and sanitary hotels, and so on. Moving on to China, China's influence operations related to the Paris Olympics are more likely to focus on promoting pro-China narratives and defending Chinese athletes against doping accusations. Historically, China has used its influence apparatus to support its own hosting of the Olympics, as seen during the 2022 Beijing Games. China is expected to broadly focus on promoting, again, that positive narrative about its athletes and countering negative allegations, particularly those related to doping. Despite political tensions, though, China is unlikely to engage in any overtly negative campaigns against France due to ongoing diplomatic and cultural exchanges and the often use of sport to promote a positive image of China and build those cultural ties. Namely, most of these activities, if we were to see some of this, would be directed at the U.S. or against some of the U.S. anti-doping agencies. We may see China resorting to employing some of its covert influence assets if tensions escalate in that space. Third, moving on to Iran, the influence operations related to the Olympics are part of a broader strategy to manipulate or influence international perceptions of Israel and its allies. We've seen, as Alex had highlighted, drawing comparisons between Israel and the IOC, the Israel participating and the IOC's ban of Russia and South Africa. In terms of covert influence operations, however, we have not seen that sort of activity yet. It's primarily out of state media like Press TV or from the social media channels of Iranian leadership. However, based on its past activities, including the Endless Mayfly influence campaign during the World Cup in 2022, Iran has demonstrated a capability to conduct cyber-enabled influence operations or covert influence operations during sporting events, and it also retains that capacity to do so. Finally, with Azerbaijan, this is an interesting one. I saw one of the questions about this earlier was, unlike traditional geopolitical powerhouses, Azerbaijan represents a growing trend where smaller states leverage or craft their influence techniques online to level that playing field and to advance their own geopolitical goals. There is some precedent for Azerbaijan political parties using influence operations to sway domestic opinion and target journalists. But this is one of the first cases in which we've seen them using their apparatus for influence operations or influence operations against the Olympics. We've seen this namely from a network that the French counter-malign influence agency Viginum had attributed to Azerbaijan last November, associated with the new Azerbaijan party. And this included a social media campaign using hashtags such as Boycott Paris 2024, Boycott Paris Olympic Games, use of AI-generated art, recycled profile photos, and then trying to tie those campaigns in with denouncing France's neocolonialism and promoting French independence movements around the globe. Much of this is tied towards those French-Azerbaijani relationship that has deteriorated over the past year and a half, namely out of the discontent France has demonstrated with Nagorno-Karabakh. And so as that continues, we may see additional themes of neocolonial independence movements from that network. From that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Matt.
Brian, real quick before we do that, there was one question, and you touched on it briefly around social media, but one of the questions was, what would this look like if you see more of the influence operations moving over into social media, and what should users look for as we maybe see an up ramp around some of that?
Yeah, so I think probably a really good case study that we've been studying a lot with social media influence operations, specifically out of Russia, is with the Doppelganger campaign, use of very spammy tactics to promote inauthentic news articles, either impersonating legitimate French media entities like Le Parisien or Le Point, or some of the multiple original inauthentic news sources that we've seen from Doppelganger infrastructure over the last several months. We often see networks of accounts with little to no following. These are accounts that might be using recycled profile photos from things like NFT art or AI generated images. Again, these campaigns tend to use spammy tactics rather than trying to build audiences or grow audiences and then propagate influence. But these are kind of rinse and repeat, often recycled accounts or accounts that are one use only, trying to inject a narrative into the mainstream. So when a social media user is often potentially a target of this campaign or something similar in their replies of their social media or whatever, often it's good to look at many of the indicators of compromise that many research firms have published about Doppelganger or other operations like Plural Combat, like the domains that are used or the tactics in which these social media operators kind of propagate that influence out. And then also, I think from just like the social media standpoint of just also adopting those IOCs to enable faster takedowns and limit the visibility of that content before it has a chance to grow an audience, especially around like a particular area such as the opening ceremonies or as the games are underway.
Thank you so much, Brian. All right, Matt.
Great, thanks. So to set the stage for my remarks, it's important to recognize that the 2024 Paris Olympics very likely represent the most challenging physical security threat landscape for an Olympic Games since those held in London 12 years ago. These games will take place in a major world capital with a greater metropolitan population of 11 million people, which has been repeatedly targeted by international terrorist groups and homegrown violent extremists over the last decade. It's also been subject to waves of violent protests in the last 18 months, over climate change, the Israel-Hamas conflict, government regulations, and pension reform. To underscore how serious the threat environment is, in March 2024, French authorities raised the country's terrorism warning level to its highest possible setting, attack emergency, indicating a threat of an attack is imminent. However, as we assessed in our report, the extensive security infrastructure that is being established for the games will render a successful mass casualty terrorist attack or major disruptive protests very unlikely. This infrastructure includes an estimated 67,000 security personnel, encompassing private contractors, police officers, and military members, as well as advanced equipment such as counter-drone technologies and AI-assisted surveillance. These are not just French resources either. French authorities have solicited law enforcement support from partners around the globe and are working closely with the United States and other allies to share intelligence on physical security threats. Based on our research, which included analysis of recent terrorist plots across Europe and the messaging application channels and private forums utilized by terrorist supporters, it's almost certain that the Islamic State, and to a lesser extent Al-Qaeda, are actively plotting or seeking to incite attacks targeting the Paris Olympics. Anarchists and other ideologically driven protest groups represent less significant physical security threats, but will likely seek to leverage the global spotlight on France to attract attention to their causes through disruptive demonstrations and confrontations with security forces. Finally, it's important to note that even foiled attacks or neutralized protests can have a psychological impact on attendees of the Olympics and disrupt the Games. What then is driving these physical security threat vectors? In terms of terrorism and violent extremism, three factors are almost certainly fueling the heightened threat environment for the Paris Olympics. First, the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas conflict has led to a surge in jihadist radicalization and mobilization in Europe. Most notably, in March 2024, Italian police arrested 3 members of the Palestinian foreign terrorist organization Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, who were reportedly planning to conduct attacks in Western Europe. Second, the Islamic State's branch in Afghanistan, IS Khorasan Province, or ISKP, has accelerated its focus on planning, guiding, and inciting external operations. This was illustrated most recently by the March 2024 terrorist attack at the Crocus City Music Hall in Moscow, Russia. Third, Islamic State-affiliated media outlets and group supporters have recently launched a campaign to promote terrorist attacks against sports stadiums in Europe, including venues that will be used during the Olympics. According to French security services, several terrorist plots targeting the country in recent months have emanated from ISKP supporters, a dynamic that is almost certain to continue in the lead-up to the event. The Islamic State almost certainly seeks to target the Paris Olympics to demonstrate its external operations capabilities and replicate the organization's 2015 attack on Paris and the 2016 truck ramming in Nice. However, due to the pervasive security footprint that is being established prior to the Games and the complex logistical, financial, and operational challenges they face, the Islamic State is very unlikely to successfully carry out a centrally coordinated mass casualty attack. In lieu of a large-scale plot, Islamic State media outlets have incited supporters in France and other Western European countries to target the Olympics. Unofficial media groups have followed suit, such as a recent publication calling for attacks on the Games using drones outfitted with explosives. This effort is almost certain to result in individual Islamic State supporters attempting or plotting to conduct low-sophistication lone actor attacks targeting the Olympics. While these attacks are more likely to be carried out successfully, they are also likely to result in limited casualties with limited impact. The recent arrests of Chechen nationals, reportedly inspired by the Islamic State to conduct attacks in France, one in late May, the other in April, are strong evidence that the incitement campaign is bearing fruit. Shifting to civil unrest and disruptive protests, France has historically seen significant levels of public demonstration, ranging from peaceful marches to full-fledged riots. Notable violent protests in recent years include the Yellow Vest movement, a year-long uprising against economic conditions, which started in November 2018, and the pension reform clashes in 2023. These have featured massive participation among the French public, drawing millions of people, and the spirit of animated political protest persists today. In conjunction with the Paris Olympics, environmental anarchists such as Extinction Rebellion and pro-Palestinian groups protesting the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict, such as Urgence Palestine, represent the most likely actors to directly target the Games, its organizers, or associated contractors. These groups will also likely hold demonstrations in Paris or near Olympic Games locations to take advantage of global media attention to publicize the causes. They are more likely to adopt more confrontational tactics, resulting in violent clashes with police or counter-protesters. We've also noted crossover between these two groups, such as a protest call by environmentalist collective Saccage 2024 to support pro-Palestinian efforts to ban Israel from participating in the Games. Moreover, events related to the Israel-Hamas conflict that cause a public uproar, such as Israeli strikes in April that killed aid workers, risk escalating protests into violent riots, particularly if those events occur during the Games. To help mitigate the potential of an insider threat, the French government has taken steps to screen volunteers for the Olympics and reject those with identified links to environmental anarchist groups. Finally, protests over national political issues in France, including farmers' protests and union strikes, are unlikely to directly target Paris Olympics organizers or events, but will likely cause incidental disruptions to public transit, major roads, or public services. A perceived lack of progress on agricultural issues before the Games and the upcoming European Parliament elections in June will likely exacerbate these grievances. These groups generally engage in peaceful operations, although dumping tons of animal manure can require an unpleasant cleanup process. And so with that visual, I will turn it back to you, Maggie.
Thank you, Matt. We have quite a few questions in the Q&A, and what I'd like to do is have Kathleen Kutzman from our technical product team walk through some of the resources that we have available, and also leave some time for the team to respond to some of the more straightforward questions in the Q&A. We'll come back after Kathleen's segment and then kind of just wrap up with any maybe particular question or just a round robin around leave behinds for the participants. So with that, Kathleen, I'll turn it over to you for now.
Sounds great. Hi, everyone. I'm going to stay off camera given I am at InfoSec London and the Wi-Fi is not the best. As Maggie mentioned, there's a lot of resources within the Reporter Feature platform that we've provided for our clients to track threats specific to their organization, but related to the Olympics coming up in Paris in just, well, next month. What I'll go through very briefly, so it shouldn't spend more than 5 minutes. I want to walk through 3 different use cases using the platform. One that's a little bit more tactical, focused on some of the state-sponsored or the Olympic-style phishing wars, and then 2 more strategic type of examples covering disinformation using Report Feature AI. One of the first examples, as I mentioned, wanted to walk through was within this intelligence kit, there are a ton of pre-built queries that any of our clients can use and customize to their own use cases, whether that's using your company as an extra term or if there are any other entities you want to correlate against some of these searches, that's all possible. If I hit the query button here, let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. This is where let me share a different screen. So I were to click on that specific query. One of the domain examples that's included in that query, so again, I'm looking for more of the type of potential phishing wars targeting the Olympics. In this case, we can see it's Paris 2042, which I'll admit when I first read that, I thought, no, definitely 2024, but Paris 2042, with the goal, again, to trick users into clicking things that they shouldn't, whether it is adware or obviously more malicious purposes, such as stealing credentials, which then can be used in a lot of different types of operations. So this is one of the more tactical ways that Report Feature can help our clients today with, again, looking for these phishing type of lures, whether it's in the platform like we're looking at right now, or we have an API where we can push this data into a SIM, into a SOAR platform. Another use case I wanted to briefly mention is how we can use the platform to specifically look at disinformation campaigns. So I have a few different pre-built queries here looking at disinformation campaigns, either targeting the Olympics, targeting France in general, or also looking for fake Olympics related images. So this is getting into how, especially generative AI, is going to be used to create images that are not real, but trying to drive some sort of ideological goal or endpoint. But clicking on that disinformation one, here I'm seeing an advanced query. Again, as I mentioned, all these queries are really building blocks for your organization to use and to customize. So whether you want to have a recurring alert that's fired on a daily basis with new information, that's all possible using the advanced query builder. Whatever other search terms you add, in this case, again, I'm just looking for disinformation campaigns. A lot of it's going to be powered by our Insikt Group team. So everyone on the call here, all of the research which our AI is also reading and being able to summarize. Where most importantly, I can click on the source itself, and I'm going to see the underlying information for why are we saying that this was a big sentence, where are we actually getting those facts from. And in this case, this is actually based off of a prior Insikt Group report about the Azerbaijani influence networks, which, as there's some comments or questions about Azerbaijan, definitely an interesting turn of events. Maybe you're not really used to seeing Azerbaijan listed with Iran and Russia in terms of especially types of influence operations. The last example I wanted to briefly walk through is Reported Feature AI. So Reported Feature AI provides our clients the ability to ask natural language or simple questions against whether it's our Insikt Group data. So I could ask a question directly to the report that was just published, or I can ask more broad questions about our collection, such as who are the top initial access brokers, like one of the questions that was actually asked, and it did get a response that I can also briefly show. But the team provides a lot of different questions as examples to start off your research. The one that I'm going to run now that I was thinking of, as Brian mentioned, the doppelganger campaign, one of the ways I was thinking of asking a question was, well, how has the doppelganger campaign specifically been used against France? So as Brian mentioned, doppelganger has been used especially against the US for any large news things that have happened, whether it's protests or I just live in Baltimore. So having that key bridge collapse, the doppelganger campaign also reposted or posted fabricated articles really talking about some of those major events. So Reported Feature AI is nicely telling me about actually a bot-driven social media campaign, also talking about larger effort within Azerbaijan. And again, just like we were able to see within the disinformation query, we're seeing it the most recent source with the Insikt report that was released today, which is great to see. And any other sourcing as well. So again, whether it's dark web sources, Telegram channels, Discord channels, all of that, we are able to ask questions of using the Reported Feature AI. Before I pivot back to the Insikt team to answer some of the questions live, I thought I could answer one of the questions actually using Reported Feature AI. So as I saw these questions come through, just asked, who are the most active initial access brokers, since I wasn't quite sure. Reported Feature AI told me Shadow Syndicate and these two other users. And again, as always, we're going to include the reference. So whether it's the Insikt team providing information on some of these threat actors selling specific access, so in this case to an unnamed US organization, lots of ways you can use the Reported Feature platform, again, for obviously Olympic focused threats like everything we've been talking about, but for any other cyber or geopolitical use cases as well. And with that, let's see what other questions team has on pivoting back.
All right, thank you, Kathleen. Just looking through the Q&A, Brian, at one point I thought there was a question you wanted to answer live, but I'm not seeing it anymore. Were you able to answer directly instead?
Yeah, Maggie, I answered it instead. I error on my part with typing it first, but the question was about how some of these campaigns, how when they're trying to achieve virality or kind of grow their networks. And my response was that I keep going back to Doppelganger because it's one of those live campaigns that we're always seeing them attempting to achieve that, but they always tend to fail. And that's more a reflection of them trying to throw something at the wall and see what sticks, or have a bit of luck to see if somebody will pick up a narrative and kind of launder that further into that mainstream discord. But there's one of the things interesting we've seen with Doppelganger a lot is there is some evidence, we're almost certain at this point, that there's some social media listening that's involved there, where they're looking at trending topics or terms, and then they kind of pivot that content to try to spam those replies or kind of inject that content. But again, because of some of the shadow banning activities or kind of the limited visibility of that activity, just because of all the reporting has been about that and some of the proactiveness, it makes it more difficult to get that content out there. So, there's pivots to other platforms. There might be some evidence of audience building or algorithmic manipulation elsewhere. But all in all, it's a continuous attempt to try to get that content out there, but has failed quite miserably.
Thanks, Brian, for sharing that with everyone. One question that came up that I'd be interested in hearing from you on is, we talk about sponsors, supply chain, companies based in France, kind of, being aware of the threats that are posed during the Olympics. But what should companies who may not be viewed as quote unquote a natural target be worried about, and what should they prepare for?
So I think one element that comes to mind for me there is kind of understanding, well, they may not be a natural target due to maybe they're in a different country and they might not have anything necessarily directly to do with the Olympics, but they will likely have a fairly long list of third parties and suppliers and vendors that may actually be directly involved in servicing the Olympics in some manner, and may be a target of potential disruption that will have a knock-on effect on their particular business and enterprise. So really understanding kind of where those risks lie, and is there a kind of key supplier within their environment that actually is a strategic part of the Olympics in some manner, and trying to articulate that risk and attempt to kind of get ahead of any threats to that particular entity, even if there may not be a direct threat to your own organization.
So the network effect of using supply chain.
Right.
Downstream. Fantastic. Thank you. Matt, what are your thoughts on drones?
Well, my thoughts on drones are it's certainly a concerning development, and I know that there was a couple of questions I think in the chats. Certainly we've seen that French authorities are taking this very seriously. The biggest concern here is the opening ceremony, which, unlike past precedent, is not going to be taking place in a specific location like the Stade de France. It's going to be taking place on the River Seine. And so it's, I think, 6 kilometers long. You've got 10,000 athletes on barges and floats, and I think something around 300,000 people that are going to be permitted to observe from the edge of the river. So this is a corridor that could be certainly utilized for drone attacks. Significant area of concern for the French. They've been testing out counter drone technology for some time now. Invested a significant amount of money into that. And there are hundreds of thousands of drones that are privately owned in France, and it's certainly not a difficult thing to be able to utilize. There is certainly attack manuals that are being published by the Islamic State and other organizations that will give you some insights into the types of drones that you could use, how you could potentially jury rig them to deliver an explosive device, for example. So it's a significant cause for concern. I think, though, that the French are going to be blanketing the area with counter drone technology, and then certainly are going to be having people on the ground using that massive sort of manpower to identify potential threats ahead of time and seek to disrupt them. We're going to continue to monitor, I think, to see how the threat picture develops. And so, for example, the President Macron has talked about potentially changing the venue of the location of the opening ceremony, and depending on how the threat picture develops. And so, if, for example, they were to uncover plots in the near term that showed evidence of drones being potentially utilized or being considered for employment in such an attack, then I think you'd see them make a change like that.
To another question, and you alluded to it a bit in terms of kind of their counter drone technology. It's in terms of, when do you anticipate, or do you already see kind of their security forces being put in place already? I know that like the infrastructure is already very prominent given the cyber conference that's going on right now in Paris. But, kind of what are you seeing, and what do you anticipate seeing unfold over the next couple of weeks as far as kind of that on the ground footprint?
Yeah, certainly they're definitely marshaling the forces in terms of like the 67,000 security personnel I mentioned in the opening brief. They're going to be ensuring that they're able to work collaboratively, test and training exercises to ensure that the various forces are interfacing properly. So that's ongoing. the real sort of security perimeter establishment is going to be taking place approximately 8 days before the opening ceremonies. That's when they're going to really begin locking down the SEN. There's a sort of security in-depth protocol that they'll be following. So, where there will be a red zone that allows some vehicular access and pedestrian access, for example. Then as you get closer to the river's edge, then there will be no vehicular access, and people will only be able to access it if, for example, they have a digital pass, they've been screened by the French government, for example. So the visible components of it, I think you're going to see take place closer to the opening ceremonies themselves, but there's certainly a lot of coordinations going on in the background right now.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, team, are there any parting thoughts that you want us to leave our participants with before we wrap this up? All right. One thing for everyone who is on the webinar that might be a Recorded Future client, we do have an experts corner coming up on Thursday, where our futurists that are client facing will be walking you through specifically some of the resources in a more in-depth level that Kathleen gave a high-level overview of on this particular call. So look for an email from Recorded Future regarding the Experts Corner on Thursday, June 6th. And with that, I will bid you all a fabulous rest of your day and week until we see you again next time. Appreciate you. Thanks so much.